You might think the most expensive color in history came from gold or rare gemstones, but you'd be wrong. It came from something much stranger: snail spit. Well, not exactly spit, but close enough to make you wonder who was desperate enough to figure this out in the first place. Let me tell you about the day I spent watching modern craftsmen recreate one of antiquity's most jealously guarded secrets: the production of Tyrian purple, a color so valuable that wearing it could literally get you executed if you weren't royal enough. Picture this. You're walking along a Mediterranean beach at dawn, and instead of seashells and seaweed, you stumble across what looks like the aftermath of a very specific kind of massacre. Thousands upon thousands of broken Murex shells scattered across the sand, each one cracked open with surgical precision. The smell hits you first. Imagine low tide, mixed with rotting fish, and a hint of something that makes your eyes water. Welcome to a Tyrian dye workshop, where the most beautiful color in the ancient world was born from one of the most disgusting processes ever invented. The numbers alone tell you this wasn't your average cottage industry. To dye a single Roman toga that deep, rich purple that screamed, "I'm important enough to have people killed," you needed roughly 12,000 Murex snails. That's not a typo. 12,000 individual sea creatures, each no bigger than your fist, all sacrificed for one garment. Do the math on outfitting an entire imperial court, and you're talking about millions of these spiny little mollusks meeting their maker in service of fashion. No wonder purple became the color of power. It was literally built on mass extinction, one shell at a time. But here's where it gets really interesting, and kind of gross. The secret wasn't in the shell itself, but in a tiny gland buried deep inside each snail. We're talking about something smaller than your pinky nail, tucked away near the creature's breathing apparatus. This little organ, called the hypobranchial gland, contained a clear fluid that most people would have dismissed as snail drool. Except when this particular drool hit sunlight and air, it started performing magic tricks that would make any chemist jealous. The process began before sunrise, when the temperature was cool enough to keep the snails from rotting faster than you could work with them. Teams of workers would gather around massive piles of Murex shells, each person armed with what looked like a tiny hammer and chisel. The technique required surgical precision. Crack the shell too hard, and you'd destroy the precious gland inside. Too gentle, and you'd be there all day trying to extract enough material to dye a handkerchief. These weren't just random laborers either. The best shellcrackers were treated like skilled craftsmen, earning wages that would make their neighbors green with envy, or should I say, purple with envy. One experienced worker could process about 200 shells per hour if everything went perfectly. That might sound impressive, until you realize they needed to maintain this pace for 10 to 12 hours straight, with nothing but short breaks to rest their cramped hands and aching backs. The workshop I visited had 3 teams working in shifts, creating a constant rhythm of crack, extract, salt, repeat that echoed across the coastal facility like some kind of ancient industrial symphony. The extraction itself was both fascinating and nauseating to watch. Using a tool that looked like a cross between a dentist's pick and a fishhook, workers would carefully remove the tiny gland from each shell. The precious fluid inside was immediately mixed with coarse sea salt to prevent decomposition. Think of it as the world's first preservative, except instead of keeping your lunch fresh, it was keeping snail secretions from turning into soup. The salted glands were then ground into a paste using stone mortars, creating what one ancient writer described as looking like grey porridge with attitude. Hojim. But the real magic happened next. In massive clay vats that dotted the workshop like ancient hot tubs from hell. The foreman, a weathered man whose hands were permanently stained various shades of purple, would charge each vat with a carefully measured mixture of seawater, lime, and the ground gland paste. The proportions were kept secret, passed down through generations like a family recipe for world domination. Too much lime, and the color would be weak and patchy. Too little, and the mixture would rot before the chemical transformation could begin. The vats were positioned to catch the morning sun, and as the temperature rose, something incredible started happening. The mixture, which had looked like muddy dishwater, began its slow transformation. First came bubbles, tiny at first, then growing larger as fermentation kicked in. The smell, which had already been challenging, evolved into something that could make a garbage collector reconsider his career choices. But for the dyers, this stench was the sweet smell of success. No bubbles meant no fermentation, and no fermentation meant no purple. The color change didn't happen overnight. This wasn't like dropping food coloring into water and watching it spread. We're talking about a chemical process that took weeks to complete, with the dyers checking their test yarns multiple times each day like anxious parents watching a thermometer. The first sign of progress came after about 3 days, when the mixture would develop a greenish tint. Not exactly encouraging if you're trying to make purple, but the experienced workers knew this was just the beginning. By day 7, that green would shift to a muddy blue-green that looked about as appealing as pond scum. Nervous clients visiting the workshop at this stage often demanded their money back, convinced they were watching their investment turn into expensive swamp water. But the smart dyers had learned to manage expectations, explaining that making Tyrian purple was like aging wine. Patience was not just a virtue, it was absolutely essential. The real excitement came around day 10, when the first hints of actual purple would start appearing in the test yarns. Not the deep, rich purple that would eventually emerge, but a pale lavender that whispered promises of what was to come. The workers would gather around the vats like gamblers watching dice roll, because even with centuries of experience, this process could still go wrong in spectacular ways. What made this whole operation even more impressive was the scale of organization required. The workshop didn't just process one batch at a time. They had dozens of vats at different stages of the process, creating a complex timeline that required the planning skills of a military campaign. Clerks with wooden tablets tracked everything: how many shells went into each batch, how much fuel was needed to maintain the right temperature, how many workers were assigned to each stage, and most importantly, how much each batch was costing to produce. The business side of Tyrian purple was as complex as the chemistry. Different shades commanded different prices, and the workshop had developed an entire catalogue of purples to choose from. There was the pale violet used for trim on wealthy merchants' clothing, still expensive, but attainable if you saved up for a few years. Then came the deeper purples reserved for nobility, each shade requiring more snails, more time, and more expertise to achieve. At the top of the pyramid was the legendary true Tyrian purple, a colour so deep and rich it seemed to glow from within. This shade was reserved for emperors and gods, and the penalty for wearing it without permission was often death. But achieving that perfect colour was only half the battle. Once the dye reached the right intensity, the real work began, turning raw purple liquid into coloured thread that would stay purple for generations. The dyeing process itself was like watching ancient chemistry in action, except the laboratory smelled like a fish market that had been left in the sun for too long. Workers would lower test skeins of wool yarn into the bubbling vats using long wooden poles, because getting too close to the mixture could leave you with a permanent reminder of your workday. The first dip was always the most nerve-wracking moment. Would this batch produce the deep purple that could buy a house, or the muddy brown that was only good for dyeing peasant clothing? Here's where things get really fascinating. The yarn didn't just soak in the dye like a tea bag in hot water. The process required what the dyers called the breathing technique. They'd dip the yarn, pull it out to let it oxidize in the air, then dip it again. Each cycle deepened the colour, but it also increased the risk of ruining the entire batch. Too many dips, and the fibres would break down. Too few, and the colour would fade faster than a suntan in winter. The transformation was mesmerising to watch. Fresh yarn would go into the vat looking like cream-coloured string, emerge dripping with what looked like green pond water, then slowly shift to blue as oxygen hit the fibers. But the real magic happened during the third or fourth dip, when that blue would suddenly deepen into purple. Not just any purple, a colour so rich and vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The first time you see this happen, you understand why ancient rulers were willing to bankrupt their treasuries for this colour. The timing had to be perfect. Leave the yarn in too long, and it would turn black. Pull it out too early, and the purple would be so pale it looked like someone had mixed grape juice with milk. The master dyers developed an almost supernatural ability to judge the exact moment when each skein had absorbed the maximum amount of colour. They'd test the yarn by rubbing it between their fingers, checking for the right texture and colour saturation. Their hands were living colour charts, permanently stained in gradients from pale lavender to deep plum. But even perfect dyeing was worthless if the colour didn't last. The quality control process was more rigorous than anything you'd find in a modern factory. Each finished skein underwent what they called the torture test, stretching, twisting, and rubbing to make sure the purple wouldn't fade or bleed onto other fabrics. The best Tyrian purple was legendary for its permanence. Archaeologists have found purple dyed fabric from Roman times that still shows traces of its original colour after 2,000 years buried in the ground. The workshop had an entire section dedicated to these quality checks, where workers would spend hours testing thread strength and colour fastness. They'd rub samples against white cloth to check for bleeding, expose them to direct sunlight for days to test for fading, and even wash them in various solutions to simulate years of wear. Any batch that failed these tests was either re-dyed or sold at a massive discount to merchants who specialised in cheaper imitations. Storage was another massive challenge. The finished yarn couldn't just be thrown in a pile and forgotten. Each skein was carefully rinsed in fresh water to remove excess dye, then treated with a light coating of olive oil to preserve the fibres and enhance the colour's depth. The oil also served as protection against moths and other insects that found purple wool as irresistible as humans did. Workers would spend days carefully bundling the finished skeins, wrapping them in clean linen cloth, and packing them into sealed amphorae for shipment. The logistics of running a Tyrian purple operation were mind-boggling. The workshop I observed went through approximately 50,000 Murex shells per week during peak season. That's not counting the shells that were cracked incorrectly and had to be discarded, or the ones that turned out to contain glands too small or damaged to be useful. The waste was staggering. For every pound of finished purple thread, they generated about 200 pounds of broken shells and organic waste. But nothing went to waste in the ancient economy. Those mountains of spent shells found new life in lime kilns, where they were burned to produce the calcium carbonate used in construction and agriculture. The smell from these kilns added another layer to the workshop's aromatic signature, creating a scent profile that locals claimed they could detect from miles away. Some towns actually used the direction of the dye works smell as a navigation aid. If you could smell the purple, you knew which way the coast was. The seasonal nature of the work created its own rhythm. Murex snails were most active and contained the highest concentration of dye during specific months, usually late spring through early fall. This meant the workshops had to operate at maximum capacity during the harvest season, then basically shut down for months at a time. Workers would migrate between different coastal sites, following the snail populations like ancient nomads chasing a very specific and smelly form of gold. The secrecy surrounding the entire operation was legendary. Master dyers guarded their techniques more carefully than military commanders protected battle plans. Different workshops developed their own variations on the basic process, creating subtle differences in colour and quality that became their trademark. Some added honey to the fermentation mixture, claiming it improved the colour's depth. Others swore by adding small amounts of indigo or madder to create unique shades that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Industrial espionage was a real concern. Rival workshops would send spies disguised as workers or customers, hoping to steal production secrets that could give them a competitive advantage. The most successful operations developed elaborate security measures, including code words for different stages of the process and carefully controlled access to the most sensitive areas of the workshop. The human cost of this industry was enormous. Workers developed permanent health problems from breathing the toxic fumes and handling corrosive chemicals all day. Their hands became so stained that they could never completely return to their natural color. Many suffered from respiratory issues that modern medicine would recognize as chemical poisoning. But the wages were good enough that people lined up for these jobs anyway, in an economy where most people lived one bad harvest away from starvation. Steady work that paid well was worth almost any risk. The most experienced workers could judge the quality of a dye batch just by smelling it. They'd walk through the workshop like sommeliers in a wine cellar, sniffing the air around each vat and making notes about fermentation progress, potential problems, or optimal harvest timing. This skill took decades to develop and was so valuable that master dyers could command salaries equivalent to skilled architects or ship captains. But all this expertise and organization meant nothing if you couldn't get your product to market safely, and that's where the real adventure began. Transportation was where the purple business got really interesting and dangerous. You couldn't exactly throw a bunch of priceless purple thread in the back of a donkey cart and hope for the best. We're talking about cargo that was literally worth more than its weight in gold. Traveling through territories crawling with bandits who knew exactly what those sealed amphorae contained. The smell alone was a dead giveaway. Once you've encountered Tyrian purple production, you never forget that distinctive aroma of fermented sea creatures and expensive ambition. The logistics were like planning a military operation, except instead of moving troops, you were moving thread that could buy small kingdoms. Each shipment required armed guards, decoy caravans, and route planning that would make modern security experts jealous. Smart merchants never traveled the same path twice, because word got around fast when someone was moving purple cargo. Highway robbery wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was a specialized profession with its own intelligence networks. Some of the cleverest smuggling techniques involved hiding the precious thread inside ordinary-looking goods. Merchants would pack purple skeins inside amphorae of olive oil or wine, betting that thieves would be more interested in liquid assets than checking for hidden treasures at the bottom. Others would disguise their cargo as common brown wool, using temporary dyes that could be washed out to reveal the purple underneath. One particularly sneaky trader reportedly transported an entire shipment of royal purple by having his workers wear it as undergarments beneath their regular clothes. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. Or in this case, where your skin is. The markup from workshop to final customer was absolutely astronomical. Thread that cost the equivalent of a decent house to produce would sell for enough to buy an entire neighborhood by the time it reached Rome or Constantinople. Every middleman along the way took their cut, and by the end of the supply chain, you were looking at price increases that would make modern pharmaceutical companies blush. A single purple-dyed toga represented the lifetime earnings of dozens of ordinary workers. But the real money wasn't in selling thread, it was in controlling the entire supply chain. The smartest operators owned everything from the snail beds to the shipping routes, cutting out the middlemen and keeping all those juicy profits for themselves. These purple barons became some of the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world, building fortunes that lasted for generations. Some families maintained their monopolies for centuries, passing down not just money, but the secret knowledge needed to maintain their purple empires. The political implications were staggering. Controlling purple production meant controlling who could wear the color of power, which meant influencing who actually had power. Several wars were fought at least partially over access to prime Murex beds. Entire cities rose and fell based on their position in the purple trade network. Archaeological evidence suggests that some coastal settlements existed solely to support Tyrian dye production, with every aspect of local life revolving around the seasonal rhythm of snail harvesting and dye making. Quality fraud was rampant throughout the industry. Unscrupulous dealers would mix genuine Tyrian purple with cheaper dyes, creating blends that looked similar but faded quickly or changed color over time. The most common scam involved using a small amount of real purple to dye the outer layer of thread, while the core remained undyed or colored with inferior substitutes. Buyers developed increasingly sophisticated testing methods, but the counterfeiters always seemed to stay one step ahead. The Roman government eventually tried to regulate the industry by establishing official testing procedures and certification systems. Imperial dye inspectors would travel from workshop to workshop, checking quality and ensuring that proper techniques were being used. These inspectors wielded enormous power. Their approval could make a workshop wealthy beyond imagination, while their disapproval could shut down operations overnight. Naturally, corruption became endemic, with workshop owners offering bribes that could fund small armies. The seasonal nature of production created wild price swings that made ancient markets look like modern cryptocurrency exchanges. During peak harvest season, when fresh Murex were plentiful and workshops were running at full capacity, prices might drop to merely outrageous levels. But during the off-season, when existing stocks were running low and no new production was possible, prices would skyrocket to the point where only the wealthiest individuals could afford even small amounts of purple trim. Smart merchants learned to play these seasonal cycles like financial instruments, buying up purple thread during the harvest glut and storing it for sale during the scarcity months. Warehouse facilities near major trading centers became as heavily guarded as military installations, protecting stockpiles of purple that represented fortunes in concentrated form. Some traders made careers out of nothing but timing the purple market, buying low and selling high, with the precision of modern commodity speculators. The authentication problem became so serious that workshops started developing their own trademark techniques, unique chemical signatures that could identify their specific production methods. Master dyers would add secret ingredients that created subtle variations in color or texture, making their purple identifiable to trained experts. These signatures were guarded more carefully than state secrets, because losing control of your trademark meant losing your competitive advantage in a market where reputation meant everything. Foreign competition was always a concern. While the Mediterranean workshops dominated the high-end market, cheaper alternatives started appearing from other regions. Indian indigo could create a decent blue-purple, and certain insects produced reds that could be mixed with other dyes to approximate purple shades. These substitutes were never quite as rich or permanent as genuine Tyrian purple, but they were affordable enough to create a secondary market for purple-ish colors. The workshops responded to this competition by doubling down on quality and exclusivity. They developed even more intense shades, created new techniques for improving color fastness, and established certification systems that guaranteed authenticity. The message was clear. You could buy purple-colored thread anywhere, but true Tyrian purple, the color of emperors, could only come from the traditional Mediterranean workshops with their centuries of expertise. Labor relations in the purple industry were surprisingly complex. While the work was dangerous and unpleasant, the wages were good enough to create a specialized workforce that had significant bargaining power. Skilled dyers could demand premium salaries and better working conditions because their expertise was irreplaceable. Several historical accounts mention work stoppages and labor disputes at major workshops, with workers using their specialized knowledge as leverage in negotiations. The most skilled workers formed something like medieval guilds, controlling access to training and maintaining professional standards. Becoming a master dyer required years of apprenticeship, during which you learned not just the technical aspects of the process, but also the business side of the operation. These guild systems helped maintain quality standards, but also kept the number of qualified practitioners artificially low, supporting higher wages for existing workers while maintaining the exclusivity that kept prices high. The environmental impact of Tyrian purple production was devastating on a local scale. Intensive harvesting could strip entire murex beds bare, forcing workshops to constantly search for new snail populations. Some regions show archaeological evidence of complete ecological collapse, with Murex populations never recovering from ancient overharvesting. The industry literally consumed its own foundation, creating a boom and bust cycle that eventually contributed to the decline of many traditional purple-producing regions. Waste management was another massive challenge. The organic waste from processing millions of snails created sanitation problems that affected entire communities. Workshop towns developed elaborate systems for disposing of shell waste and processing organic byproducts. But the sheer volume of waste often overwhelmed these early environmental controls. Archaeological sites near ancient dye works still show elevated levels of certain chemicals, testament to the industrial scale of these operations. The religious and cultural significance of purple added another layer of complexity to the entire industry. In many societies, wearing purple without proper authorization wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was blasphemy. The color was associated with divinity, royalty, and supernatural power. This religious dimension meant that purple production was often regulated not just by economic considerations, but by religious authorities who controlled who could wear what colors. Some workshops actually employed priests or religious advisors to ensure that their production methods didn't violate religious taboos. Certain dyeing techniques were considered sacred, and some colors were reserved for specific religious ceremonies or seasonal festivals. The intersection of commerce and spirituality created opportunities for both profit and conflict, as workshops navigated between maximizing production and respecting religious constraints. The decline of Tyrian purple wasn't sudden. It was a slow collapse that took centuries to complete. Several factors contributed to the industry's eventual downfall, but the primary cause was simple economics. As the Roman Empire fragmented and trade networks collapsed, the elaborate supply chains needed to support purple production became increasingly difficult to maintain. Workshops found themselves cut off from markets, suppliers, and the steady stream of wealthy customers who made the whole system profitable. The discovery of alternative dye sources accelerated this decline. When traders started importing cochineal from the Americas and other exotic dyes from Asia, the European purple market faced competition from colors that were easier to produce and transport. While these alternatives never quite matched the prestige of traditional Tyrian purple, they were good enough for most customers and significantly cheaper to obtain. But perhaps the most ironic factor in purple's decline was its own success. As production techniques spread and new workshops opened in different regions, the exclusivity that made purple valuable began to erode. When anyone with enough money could buy purple clothing, it lost its power as a symbol of ultimate status. Fashion moved on to new ways of displaying wealth and power, leaving the purple industry to serve an increasingly small market of traditionalists and religious institutions. The final blow came from an unexpected source: chemistry. Medieval alchemists, tinkering with their potions and formulas, accidentally stumbled upon synthetic ways to create purple dyes. These laboratory-produced colors weren't quite as rich or permanent as the snail-based originals, but they could be made year-round without depending on Murex populations or seasonal harvesting cycles. More importantly, they could be produced by anyone with the right knowledge and materials, breaking the ancient monopolies that had controlled purple for over 1,000 years. The last traditional Tyrian purple workshops held on longer than you might expect, serving a shrinking market of religious institutions and die-hard aristocrats who insisted on the authentic experience. But by the Renaissance, most of these operations had either closed or adapted to producing other luxury dyes. The final commercial Murex-based purple workshop reportedly closed its doors in the early 1400s, ending a tradition that had lasted for millennia. Modern attempts to recreate authentic Tyrian purple have revealed just how remarkable these ancient operations really were. Contemporary chemists working with sophisticated equipment and detailed knowledge of the chemical processes involved still struggle to match the consistency and quality that ancient workshops achieved using nothing but experience, intuition, and an impressive tolerance for terrible smells. The precision required to manage dozens of fermentation vats simultaneously, each at different stages of the process, represents a level of industrial organization that rivals modern manufacturing. So there you have it, the complete story of how 12,000 dead snails became a single purple toga, and why that ridiculous process shaped empires for over a millennium. The math tells the whole story. 50,000 shells per week, 3 weeks minimum per batch, wages equivalent to master craftsmen, and prices that could bankrupt kingdoms. No wonder wearing the wrong shade of purple could get you executed. When your entire color palette depends on seasonal snail harvesting and trade routes more complex than modern shipping networks, exclusivity isn't just about fashion, it's about survival. The next time you see purple, remember you're looking at the color that built fortunes, toppled governments, and proved that sometimes the most beautiful things in the world come from the most absolutely disgusting processes imaginable.